Hi guys, this is your memory chapter. All right, so in our current textbook, it is going to be part of the unit that has memory, thinking, language, and intelligence all into one. So it's basically underneath the cognition unit. So this one is just on memory. I will do a separate PowerPoint for thinking and language and for intelligence. All right, so for memory, memory is the persistence of learning over time through the storage and retrieval of information. For this chapter, there was a lot of like 3 steps or 3 processes or 3 stages. And so your 3-stage process is going to be encoding, storage, retrieval. In the textbook, it oftentimes will compare your memory storage unit and the whole process to a computer. And so the first thing you have to do when you are encountering information is you have to encode it. So just like a computer, when you first type into the computer, whatever data is inputted there, that is going to basically be considered encoding. Okay, then afterwards, the retention of encoded material over time. So this is going to be your storage. This is where you're going to click save on the computer or in Google Docs. It just automatically does it for you. So it's just going to basically store it in there. And so for you guys in your brains, when we're trying to memorize something, we're going to first understand the information, we're going to encode it, and then we're going to store it. And then the last process is going to be retrieval. So it's the process of getting information out. So this is going back to your computer and reopening up the document. So you have encoding, storage, and retrieval. So when you first encode something, so let's say you're listening to a lecture, if you don't necessarily encode it correctly the first time, it's going to be really hard for it to go into storage and then obviously then to retrieve it. So the encoding part is really important, but also are all 3 steps. Okay, so this is called flashbulb memory. It is a clear moment of emotionally significant moment or event. So normally when I teach this, we talk about first kisses or 9/11. What's really interesting now is I feel like I'm going to change this example now to essentially maybe COVID. And so for a lot of us during this time, there's a lot of high emotions, high intensity. And so it's like a light bulb. There's a flash in our system. And so when we think back of this time, the memory is going to be very emotion evoking, and so it's considered a flashbulb memory. Okay, this is going to be another 3-step process. It's going to be sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. So sensory memory is the immediate initial recording of sensory information in the memory system. So this is like the first time you're hearing a word, reading a word, seeing a word. So your ability to even just read the sentence from beginning to end is all part of our sensory memory. So it's the initial like encountering of the sensory info, whether it's taste, smell, hearing, yada, yada. Okay. This is also kind of another example of this would be, like let's say you're zoning out in lecture and then I call on you, but your ability to be able to kind of like spit back the information is essentially kind of like sensory memory, because even though you're kind of zoning out, you still got some of it. And so it may not last longer than a few seconds, but you're able to retrieve it and then be able to basically said what you heard. Okay, then most of the work is going to be in short-term memory. So short-term memory, the number for how many units we can encode is going to be 7 plus or minus 2. So that's kind of like the magic number. Is that with phone numbers, that's actually out of our 9 units. So 7 plus or minus 2 is going to be 9. And so anything over 9 is going to be really hard for us to basically keep in our memories. And so that's why with phone numbers, most of us don't look at phone numbers as like 10 different digits. Usually, especially if you're a 714, that is so automatic for a lot of us because a lot of us are 714. So that becomes actually 1 unit. And so then that decreases our 10 to about 7, 8. If you then chunk the 3 and then the 4, it becomes even smaller than the actual 10. Okay, it's oftentimes called working memory because we're doing most of the work. And so for a lot of times for us, when we are encountering memory, our working memory, for some of you guys are really audio. So that's like, if you're memorizing a list of vocab words, this is you constantly repeating it back to yourself so you can like hear it. Some of you it's visual, it's like actually writing it down. Those of you that take notes in class, you're probably a combination of audio and visual, because for you to actually write it down helps you then keep the memory in your storage. And then again, kind of both. Okay. Then our last part is long-term memory. So this is relatively permanent and limitless. And so, over your lifespan, you guys are going to have a ton of long-term memories. Whatever you remember now from childhood is probably going to always be in your memory for the long haul because it's already been, 15, 16, 17, 18 years. And so your childhood memory that you still have will probably still stay with you into adulthood. Alrighty, so kind of working out how this is going to look in a real life scenario. You go to a party, someone says, hey, my name is Linda. You just hearing her name first is sensory memory. Then your working or short-term memory has to really think about it. Was it Linda, Janet, Tina? What does she look like? Do I know her? So you have to pay attention to her. Then if you really connect with her, then she's going to end up in your long term. So if you guys become best friends or she's connected to a family member or you start dating, then she's going to basically move from sensory all the way then to long term. Okay, so then when it comes to encoding information, so that was all intro to memory. This is now step by step. So encoding information, okay, we have two types of encoding. We have automatic processing and effortful processing. So automatic processing is very unconscious. So if I say, hey, stop that, or I call you a jerk, that's pretty automatic because you already know what that word means, and so it's pretty quick. But if I was to use a word you've never heard before, or you were just learning the word jerk for the first time, it may not be as automatic. But a lot of times what used to be effortful can then become automatic. So effortful processing takes essentially effort. And so rehearsal is going to be the most common form of effortful processing technique. And so let's say it's a vocab word that you didn't initially know, but then you started to rehearse it. You used it in your everyday language. You wrote it in your essays. Eventually, the more time you spend on it, the more likely it's going to end up being automatic. Okay, so this is remember we did the activity in class where we had each person go around and say, hi, my name is so-and-so, my favorite food is X, Y, and Z, and then the next person had to say the other person in front of them, their person's name and their favorite food and their food and so on. We didn't get through the whole class that day because there was just too many and a lot of you guys have good memories, but it ended up being where the person right after the person that had just spoken was more likely to forget what that other person had just said because they were next in line. So a lot of times when we are being introduced to someone, when someone says, hi, my name is so-and-so, and then you say, oh, my name is so-and-so, and you're like, shoot, what was that person's name? It's because we were next in line to say our name. So we're so focused on what we're going to say that we aren't really paying attention to what they've said. So that's called next in line effect. Okay, this looked like a lot of you guys during the school year. Essentially, you guys don't want to cram, but I know a lot of you guys love cramming and it's worked for you and procrastination is your thing. But ideally, we want to do that. We want to do spacing effects. We want to space out information. So instead of, memorizing all 40 words the night before, you want to do maybe 5 a day or 8 a day. And so by the time you actually get to the test, it's not going to take as much effort to have to memorize all 40. But I can talk about this all day, and you guys are still going to do what you want to do, which is fine. But just know that spacing effect is more ideal. Okay, what was it called? So we did this activity as well, where I had you guys memorize this. I gave you it's a minute to look at it, and then some of you guys created stories. Some of you guys made a song. Some of you guys just said it out loud. Some of you guys just envisioned it. So basically, most of you were able to remember this part and this part, but everything in the middle kind of went away and got forgotten. So what is that term called? Okay. That one is called the serial position effect. So serial is like the number of items. Where it's positioned on the curve is where we're most likely to forget. So we're more likely to remember best the last and first items on a list. So here and here. Okay, so what is it called when I'm able to remember the first items? That is called primacy effect. And then our ability to remember the last items is called recency effect. And this whole idea falls underneath serial position effect. We have also heard of these two words in another chapter, which they're apparently not testing you guys on, but it was in our social site chapter on impressions. So first impressions, lasting impressions. Okay, so this is the one where we're more likely to remember things that sound weird. So this word in itself actually sounds weird also. So we talked about, I think, presidents. So most of us are going to remember like assassinations or something that was weird about them or something that was like a scandalous because it's more likely because it's weird. So we're more likely to remember. So that whole idea is called von Restorff effect. So to me, this word sounds weird in itself. So that's the whole idea, that we are more likely to remember unique or strange things. Okay, so then we have different types of encoding. So the concoding of meaning, like the meaning of words, every time you see the word meaning, you want to connect that with semantic. So semantic meaning, we have acoustic meaning, which is sounds, and then we have visual encoding, which is images. So the best form, the one that works the best is going to be meaningful encoding or semantic. So anytime you apply things that are meaningful to you, you're more likely to then remember it. Okay, so again, what is it called when I apply everything excuse me, to your own life? You want to always refer back to yourself. That is the easiest way to remember vocab words. So that is called the self-reference effect. You want to refer it back to self. Okay, tricks to encode. So a lot of times we use imagery. Some of you guys will use jingles, phrases, acronyms. All of those are considered mnemonic devices. So like trying to remember, I think the operations of math, it's like, what is it? A pen. We always use, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. So whatever you guys use, that would essentially be tricks for encoding, a mnemonic device. Okay, this one, a lot of times you don't want to remember everything all at once. You want to essentially chunk them. So this is making them into more manageable units. Using hierarchies or headers or organization are all helpful ways to chunk info. So in class, we had done this one where I'd put all the words together without the little dashes. And so a lot of you guys end up chunking it. Instead of looking at all of these letters, which I think is 16 of them, I'm not going to count them all right now. That's out of our 7 plus or minus 2. So then a lot of you start chunking it. You're like, okay, General Motors, CBS, IBM the computer, AT&T, CIA, and FBI. So that became 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 chunks, which is actually within our 7 plus or minus 2. Okay, then we have retrieval. So that was encoding. Okay, so when it comes to retrieval, we have maintenance rehearsal and elaborate rehearsal. So maintenance rehearsal is basically just remembering things just for what it is. It's like memorizing it and then regurgitating and not making any meaningful connections to it. It's just constant repetitive memorization. Elaborative rehearsal is more ideal. So you making things elaborate, meaningful, connecting to yourself is more likely to then have good retrieval. Okay, so then we talked about recognition and recall. Here we go. Recognition is going to be the easiest type of memory task. So you being able to recognize someone's face is going to be way easier than you recalling their name and like pulling it from, thin air. So that's why a lot of us like multiple choice questions, even though they're not testing you as that on that this year, which is also kind of annoying. But because we like multiple choice because the answer's there. You just have to be able to recognize it and use context clues to be able to figure it out. What they are going to test you on is going to be more recall. Okay, this is going to it's going to be more difficult because you are basically asked to retrieve information without any sort of recognition. So they are going to provide you guys bullet points of words, but no context clues behind it. So then us having to retrieve it from our brains is a lot harder than recognition. Okay, then relearning. So those of you that end up majoring in psychology, your Psych 101 class, or even a lot of the information in your maybe upper division courses, if it sounds any similar to this class, you're going to have a lot easier time relearning it, and it's going to be much quicker than the first time you learned it. Okay, so then we often use a process called BLINK, which is the activation of associations in our memory to help us retrieve information. So we talked about this in our sensation perception chapter. This is called priming. So certain things are going to make associations or click for us another thing that's associated with it. So we have 2 types of priming. Repetition priming. Okay, is referring to the fact that it is easier and quicker to recognize a face or word if you have recently seen it over and over again. So I think that the example we used for here was I had shown you guys this image and then I had switched the screen and I kind of asked some of you, who was that? A lot of people in a few years back said, oh, that's Rihanna. Even though if you look at her, it actually isn't Rihanna. But during that time where she was really big and popular, or the whole drama with her and Chris Brown and, the domestic violence case, all of that, when she was constantly in the news media, us being able to recognize someone that kind of looked like her, we're more likely to say, hey, I think this is so-and-so because it's repetitively shown to us. Okay, this one is semantic priming. So let's say you see a tall Asian woman with long black hair at Starbucks and you're studying psychology. You might initially say, oh, hey, that must be Miss Yen because you're connecting meaningful things between psychology and me. And so then you're going to it's going to prime you to think one thing over another. Okay, so this one also is if I was to show you a bunch of rabbits or my hair, and then I asked you to spell hair, people that saw rabbits are going to spell hair this way. People that saw my hair, we talked about hair or, going to a stylist or whatever, we'd spell it H-A-I-R. Okay, this one is pretty much where you are going to put yourself back in the same situation, same environment that you first learned the material. And so this is one of the examples we talked about. Don't use the vocab word within itself. So this one is called context effect. So if you guys happen to get this on the FRQ, don't say it's putting yourself back in the same context. I mean, I know in the definition it says you can, but you need to elaborate on that. So say, putting yourself back in the same context like your environment situation in which you first encoded the information. For example, your application can be, I learned all of my psychology information in my bedroom. Sally is more likely to remember that information if she's put back into the same bedroom. So that way it helps her encode, retrieve the information. Okay, this one is state-dependent memory. So state-dependent and then the next slide, which is mood congruent, oftentimes get confused. So state-dependent memory basically means that you are more able to retrieve information in the same emotional and psychological state that you were in when it first happened. Okay, so this is basically if you are upset, in the middle of you being upset, you misplace your keys. Okay, and then you walk away and then you are searching for your keys, where are my keys? You're more likely to remember where you put your keys is if you were to put yourself back in a state of being upset or angry again. The experiment that they did with this was that if somebody was drunk and forgot something or learned something, they're more able to relearn it again if they were drunk again. Not saying that any of you guys should ever be drunk, but that's kind of how that works. It's the same thing where if we're fighting with a spouse or a friend or your parents, and we start bringing up old memories that, like let's say your mom is really frustrated with you. She's like, oh my gosh, you always do this. This is just like the same time that you did X, Y, and Z. And you're like, oh, mom, why are you bringing that up again? The reason she's bringing it up again is because in that moment that she's yelling at you or whatever, she is already in an emotional state that mirrors past when she was upset the first time with you. So she's in the same state again. And so then that is going to help her actually remember all the other times that you've upset her. Okay, this one is called mood congruent. So basically, whatever mood you are in right now, you are going to make everything congruent with that mood. So if I'm currently really stressed out and someone asks me, how was your week? I'm going to paint the whole week as pretty much really stressed out. If I'm currently in a good mood and someone asks me, how was your weekend? Even though if I might not really remember, I'm going to paint most of it as a good thing. And so that's kind of how that one works, which is different from state dependent. So that's why when people are depressed, it can get really tricky because they're going to kind of put on their dark glasses and paint everything and all their memories as depressive or sad or disappointing because that's what their current mood is. Okay, then moving on to forgetting. So we have encoding failure. A lot of times when we don't encode correctly, we're going to fail to retrieve the information and then it will not last into long-term memory. Okay, so storage decay. So even if we encode information really well, we can forget it because obviously our brains cannot hold every piece of information that we've ever learned in our whole entire lives. So the king of forgetting is Ebbinghaus. So we have one king and one queen in this chapter. Our king is Ebbinghaus, and then our queen is going to be Loftus, which will be later. Okay. So according to Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve, what we learn initially is going to have a huge drop in retention, and then it's going to level off. So for you guys, I'm really, really hoping that COVID did not drop your retention. I'm hoping the drop can happen after the AP exam. And so what normally happens is, let's say, how do I erase this? Okay, so right now, here you've learned a bunch of vocab words from this whole year. We're doing review PowerPoints. You're doing all the things you're supposed to be doing. And then you guys take your test. Immediately after the test, your retention is going to drop. Okay, but then let's say you enter freshman year of college or your first year. Whatever you remember is going to get leveled off, and it's going to stay with you for most of it. So hopefully you can retain a lot of it, but there is going to be this initial drop. Okay, then retrieval failure. The memory was encoded. It was stored, but I simply just cannot access it. So this is called the tip of the tongue phenomenon, where it's like, oh my gosh, like I know it. It's like right there, but I just can't spit it out. It's like on the tip of my tongue. It's probably because when you first learned the information, it was probably incomplete or imperfect learning, or maybe you were slightly distracted, but then the other parts of you were listening and like encoding it, but not perfectly. Or it could be the fact that you don't have the right context clues to help you remember. So then you like walk away, and then all of a sudden, like randomly, you go, oh my gosh, I now remember. So tip of the tongue phenomenon. Okay. Then we have interference and displacement. So interference and displacement is to cause chunks of information to be lost from short-term memory by adding new items. So the example we gave for this one is essentially like a shelf. So if I have a shelf with no backing and I keep putting cans and cans of soup, the more stuff I shove into the shelf, the items in the back are going to get displaced, or it's going to be interfered with another can of soup. Okay, so there's two types of interference theory. Okay, we have retroactive and we have proactive. So just a disclaimer for any parents that are, watching this or reading this, I know the next word is going to look really inappropriate. It's just a mnemonic device that we as teachers have created that actually can help some students. If it's not helpful, then totally skip this part and delete it. Okay, so we have proactive interference. So this is the disruptive effect of prior learning, so old learning, on the recall of new information. So basically, old is going to interrupt new. So if you call your new girlfriend your ex-girlfriend's name, that is proactive interference. Okay, if you write 2019, even though it's 2020, that is going to be proactive interference. Okay, retroactive interference is the disruptive effect of new learning on the recall of old information. Okay, so every time I get a new set of students, my ability to remember my old set of students becomes a lot harder because the new information is now clouding the old information. Okay, so porn is your inappropriate mnemonic. Again, parents, I apologize. So proactive interference is basically the old interferes with the new, whereas retroactive interference is new affects the old. So that's the only reason why we use this mnemonic, is because whatever letter comes after it, is interrupting the next set of information. So again, proactive is old interferes with new info. Retroactive is new interferes with old information. Alrighty, then we have something called motivating forgetting. Freud would call it repression, that even though we don't know that we are doing it, a lot of times we might be motivated to forget something because it's painful, anxiety-provoking, shameful, fearful, any of those different things. So one thing can be, I think the example I gave in class is, let's say you ate a bunch of food. So during COVID, a lot of us are overeating or snacking because we're bored. Let's say a part of us forgets like how much we've eaten because we're either ashamed or we're gaining weight or whatever. We might have forgotten that we ate an entire pint of ice cream or a Pepe's burrito or a whole pizza or how many slices we eat, because for Freud, he'd say that there's a part of us that is motivated to forget. Okay, the memory construction, we sometimes will alter our memories as we encode or retrieve them. So a lot of us are not going to have the same memories, even though we're kind of experiencing some of the same things. So that can be in a conversation, it can be COVID. A lot of times we're going to look back on certain similar situations in a different lens because we're all different humans and we all have different schemas and memory abilities and experiences. Okay, so this one is called misinformation effect. It's incorporating misleading information into one's memory of an event. So this is basically you misrepresent something you've heard, or you thought you heard something, or you thought you experienced it this way, but then someone says, oh no, that didn't happen. So you incorporating misinformation is going to be led by Loftus. So, and the experiment that they did with this one is the car crash accident. So my IB students, you should be really familiar with this one because it was part of your magics. So the question was about how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other. So the whole point of this experiment was that wording could essentially produce misinformation. So Elizabeth Loftus said that memories are distorted by our biases and our needs, and by the way we conceptualize our world, essentially our schema. So a way of representing the world is a schema. It's our mental mold of how we represent the world and what our beliefs and expectations are, whether it's of high school, of teachers, of male or female. We have all these different schemas for the world. Okay, so she basically showed the car crash, and then the questionnaire would ask how fast were the cars going at the time when the cars blanked into each other. So simply changing this word, smashed or hit or bumped, your schema of those words are going to basically influence how you report how fast the cars were going and what you remember. So if I was to say, oh, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other, you're more likely to rate something high because our schema for smashed is something that's fast, whereas hit might be lower and then bump a lot lower. Then the other question they asked them was, did glass shatter during the accident? So our memories are going to say yes if it says, did glass shatter when the cars smashed into each other? Because our schema for smash is high impact. Even though a lot of people reported yes, the glass had shattered, there actually was no glass that had shattered. It was part of the experiment. Okay, then this one is we attribute to the wrong source an event we have experienced, heard about, read about, or imagined. So that is going to be called either source amnesia. So we have amnesia for the source of like where we got the info, or it can be source attribution, what we attribute the source to. So this can be, you're telling a friend a story and you're like, oh my gosh, guess what I heard? And then your friend says, hey, I'm the one that told you that. So then that would basically mean that you had the wrong source or you had amnesia for that info. Or let's say you thought you had experienced something or had heard something from one person, but really it was from another person. Or maybe it happened in your dream, or it happened on a TV show, but not actually had happened. So you're attributing it to the wrong source. All right, then we have amnesia. So this is our inability to remember anything before the ages of 2 or 3. Usually we have that because there's no meaningful stories or connections for a lot of people this age. Also, the lack of language can also contribute to this amnesia, which is infantile amnesia, because it looks like the word infant, so like babies. So most people have no memories before the age of 2 or 3 that they can actually remember. All right, we have 2 more amnesias. So these 2 amnesias are actually due to head injury, not dissociative amnesia, which we learned in our disorders chapter. So dissociative amnesia is basically psychological trauma. These next 2 amnesias are due to actual physical trauma. So this one is going to be, antegrade. So antegrade amnesia is the failure to remember events that occurred after physical trauma because of the effects of the trauma. So you get into a car accident, you get hit in the head, your inability to have any memories after the car accident is going to be called anterograde amnesia. So those of you that have seen the movie 50 First Dates, basically she gets into a car accident, and so every day after the car accident, she can't create any new memories. So then that would be called anterograde amnesia. The normal amnesia that we normally will think of is going to be retrograde. So this is basically you get hit in the head. It's a failure to remember events that occurred prior to physical trauma because of the head injury. So this is like, I forgot my childhood, or I forgot my mom or my dad, or I forgot what I did yesterday, but then you can build on future memories. So this one's kind of like you lose your past, whereas this one you lose your future. So it really depends on which one you think is worse. And then the video I had shown you guys of the older man, Clive Waring, he was the one that was playing the piano, but he had forgotten all his memories, and the only thing that he could remember was his wife, and it only happened in like little small increments, and then he would quickly forget the sentence that he was in. And so he had a combination of both anterograde and retrograde amnesia. Alrighty guys, so that is your lecture for memory. Remember, this one is part of cognition, so it is tied to thinking, language, and intelligence. I will see you guys later.